Hi, I'm Karen Harrington. I'm a member of Climate Reality Bay Area, and I'm co-chair of our chapter's Our Climate Moment team. Thank you for attending our presentation, The Filibuster, Obstruction or Liberation. So this year, as a new administration committed to fighting the climate crisis was sworn into office, Climate Reality Project launched a new campaign, Our Climate Moment. Our Climate Moment is an opportunity to engage as a climate reality leader at the federal level. Climate Reality Bay Area, our Climate Moment team pushes our legislators to pass swift, bold, and decisive legislation that addresses climate change. This team meets with members of Congress, encouraging support for our climate priorities and airing our concerns about false solutions. So to do this work, we stay informed about bills before Congress and about the process of how bills get passed, amended, and defeated. The filibuster is a part of this process. So we have asked Stephen Golub to help us all understand the filibuster and its influence on climate legislation. So Stephen is an attorney and an expert on global democracy, and we're very excited that he has agreed to speak with all of us this evening. He will take us through a brief history of the intent, creation, and mutation of the rule and answer your questions about the short and long-term impacts of eliminating it. He is an international development scholar and consultant with more than 25 years of experience in 40 countries spanning the globe. He has consulted and conducted research for numerous leading multilateral and bilateral agencies, foundations, policy institutes, universities, and non-governmental organizations. His work has centered on promoting democracy and justice. Professor Golub is a Harvard Law School graduate whose academic background includes teaching courses on international development at Berkeley Law School and Central European University, and on refugee policy at Tufts University. He blogs on democracy and related topics at A Promised Land, America as a Developing Country. Following his presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please type them into chat. Maricel Lancero is from the Our Climate Moment team, and Audrey Heller, who is co-chair of the Our Climate team, will be handling your questions. And as a courtesy to our speaker and attendees, please mute yourself during the presentation. So Professor Golub, thank you so much for tonight's talk. Let's get started.
Well, great. Thanks very much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you folks. I guess I'll start by just saying, even though I've looked at the filibuster phenomenon and institution over the years, I don't want to present myself as a premier authority on it. I do have some knowledge of comparative democracy, and the filibuster is kind of an odd egg compared to the way many legislatures work around the globe. Having said that, I do have some knowledge of this, and I'll dive into it right now. I guess I should explain that we are dealing with a very complicated set of rules with respect to the filibuster and Senate procedures more generally. As E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post has written, the Senate rules are such that even a gifted Talmudic scholar would have trouble explaining them. So I'm not a Talmudic scholar. I'm certainly not a gifted Talmudic scholar, but I'll do my best here. Anyway, the term filibuster comes from a combination of Dutch and French and Spanish words that go back centuries. Most recently, in a relative sense, in the 19th century, the Spanish term filibusteros was used to apply to US citizens who were trying to foment revolutions in Latin America. It was then adapted in the 1850s in the Senate, in our Senate, to apply to people who seem to be sabotaging congressional proceedings by talking and talking and talking to delay the consideration of legislation and other business. Before going further, I'm going to put out a couple of questions for you folks. Please feel free to use the chat function to try to answer them if you're so inclined. If you don't have answers, obviously don't be embarrassed. But if anyone wants to venture answers, there's no such thing as a stupid answer, just a stupid question. Please feel free. First, which part of the Constitution provides for the filibuster? Which part of the US Constitution provides for the filibuster? Okay, instant answer from our very well-informed audience. So much for my trick question. You got me, folks. At least 4 of you and 5 of you. The numbers are increasing. Okay, very good. It's not in the Constitution. It's not even in any law. It's just in the rules of the Senate that the Senate has set itself. Okay, here's the second question that may be a little tougher, although maybe a little unfair also, but it does have a real answer. Which famous American is arguably most responsible for the filibuster? Any guesses? Again, there's no such thing as a bad or stupid answer here. Strom Thurmond, okay, that's or Senator Byrd. Very good answers. I would argue they're wrong, but very good answers. Okay, there's no absolutely right answer. I think in some ways you folks, Thomas Jefferson, excellent answer, but wrong. Or all of them, Calhoun, you're coming up with good answers. And to be fair, I'm not saying the answer I'll provide you is really absolutely the right answer, but what Jimmy Stewart, what I'll toss out there is Aaron Burr, who was the Vice President of the United States early in the history of the country. And the reason I say this is because in 1789, when the US Senate first convened, it adopted a very straightforward, commonsensical rule about closing debate on a matter so that the Senate could go ahead and vote. And that rule was all you needed was a majority of the Senate to say, okay, we're ready to vote, and therefore go ahead. That would have translated into 51 votes in our modern Senate. But Aaron Burr, as vice president, who's also noteworthy, by the way, for killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, but that's another matter, said in 1805, he's pointed out to the Senate, look, we've never really had to use this rule. Maybe we've used it once or twice. Why do we even need it? And it's a little bit lost in the mists of history, but whether it was a mistake or not, the Senate then just abolished that rule. So it then abandoned any formal process for really closing debate on a matter. So the majority rule of we have a majority to, we just need a majority to end the debate went out the door, and there was nothing that it replaced it. Now, this actually wasn't a problem for most of the 19th century. There were occasions when senators would stand up and try to delay a vote or force a compromise or prevent a vote from taking place by talking and talking and talking for hours. But it wasn't a huge obstacle or a huge issue in the 19th century simply because the Senate didn't work that way then. It wasn't as though people were looking on an everyday or annual basis to obstruct vital legislation, at least not in that way. These were like kind of the informal norms of the Senate in the 19th century for all of its other flaws. And as we've discovered, however, informal norms, if there are no formal laws to really block them, could really lead to problems in democracy, as we've discovered in recent years, not just regarding the filibuster. In any event, just to be clear, what the filibuster was historically, for much of this country's history, was a senator would just take to the floor of the Senate, or a bunch of them would, and to try to delay a piece of legislation from being considered, or maybe to force a compromise, or maybe to force it from being considered at all. It rarely worked, but that's what it was. It rarely worked in terms of absolutely blocking legislation, but that's what it was for a good part of the country's history. Having said that, in 1946, and this gets a bit more into the filibuster's history, a group of senators actually did block an anti-discrimination bill that was being considered by the Senate for a number of weeks, to the degree that the Senate dropped considering it. Someone mentioned Strom Thurmond as being very responsible for the filibuster. Well, he was a segregationist senator from South Carolina, I believe, who held the record for filibustering for more than 22 hours straight at one point. Eventually, however, in about 1917, a mechanism called cloture was introduced, C-L-O-T-U-R-E, a cloture bill to bring to a close debate, or not a bill, a cloture rule was adopted by the Senate to bring to a close the debate, a debate in a way that had never been formalized before. And then in various points in the 20th century, this rule said it had to be 2/3 of the Senate or 2/3 of the senators who were present at a given point. Finally, in 1975, the rule was changed by the Senate so that it only required 60 senators to bring a cloture motion, to pass a cloture motion. Again, that motion being a vote to say we're going to stop debate, we're bringing it to a close so we can go ahead and vote on a law or something else being considered by the Senate. Having said that, and that's the way it is today for most pieces of legislation. That's why de facto, you need not 50 senators or 51 senators, or as is the case right now, 50 senators plus Vice President Harris to pass legislation. You really, in effect, need 60 senators to agree to not block it, to move ahead with a vote on a piece of legislation. But there are two major exceptions to this rule. First of all, there are certain, and they're sometimes called carve-outs. One is that for certain budgetary matters, including the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill that President Biden, infrastructure and more bill that President Biden has proposed, you only need a majority of the Senate to pass something like that. You can't do it for every budgetary matter that comes up. Really, the Senate parliamentarian, who is in the ironic position, even though they're just an appointee, of deciding on these matters, has said that maybe once or twice a year you could do it. But it is the case that for a major budget reconciliation bill, a major budgetary bill, in other words, the Senate doesn't need 60 votes to bring a vote to bring a matter to a vote. It only needs a majority, 50 plus the vice president, or 51. The other carve out, the other exception is for appointees, presidential appointees to such as cabinet secretaries, other high-ranking officials, judges, and Supreme Court justices. That's another exception to the rule. These rules were brought in for political reasons when things were going on. The budget reconciliation change, I believe, was in the 70s. This change that allowed the exception to the rule for justices and judges and other presidential appointees were within the past decade. But that's where it stands now. Those two major exceptions. But things like climate change, unless they're introduced in the reforms are introduced in the context of a budget resolution, aren't allowed if they're not considered part of a budget. They need 60 votes to, in effect, to move ahead. Now, but the most important change, really, regarding the filibuster, even more important than what I've just discussed, is in the 1970s, the Senate adopted rules that allowed for what could be called a virtual or silent filibuster. That is, you no longer had to go stand up in front of the Senate, you and one or more of your and perhaps one or more of your colleagues, and talk and talk and talk to try to get a compromise, or to try to get a delay, or to try to get the Senate to simply abandon a bill. The Senate adopted rules, for better or worse, I would argue mostly worse, that said you could simply note that you intended to filibuster, and that's all you needed to do. You could note an objection, and then the Senate would need, again, 60 votes to move on to end a kind of debate on the bill. So that was a major change, whereas formerly people had to stand up, get publicity, maybe attract bad attention, inconvenience themselves and their fellow senators, go through the pain of standing for 10 or 20 hours. Now they simply have to say, no, I'm filibustering, or I'm objecting. And that's what's made, and that's contributed tremendously to the huge rise in the number of filibusters and resulting attempts to end them through cloture votes. For example, from 1917 to 1970, there was one cloture motion per year. From 71 to 2006, there were 26 per year. From 2007 to now, there were almost 100 a year. And consider the fact that the Senate meets only about 140 days a year. That means that a lot of its business can be clogged up with de facto filibusters and cloture votes. And even more significantly, much less legislation is being passed now because of this 60 vote minimum that you in effect need to really adopt a new law. So that's the history, however briefly or not. Someone's asking, why on the earth haven't they fixed it? Why won't they fix it? Good question. I'm going to get into the arguments as neutrally as I can for the moment for and against it. One argument, here's some arguments for this filibuster, that it promotes compromise and deliberation. That is, if you need more than 50 votes, if you need 60 votes for a piece of legislation to move forward, then you're more likely to get compromises that reflect more of the country. And you're more likely to have a deliberative process. That's one argument to it. Another is that it constrains majority power so that a majority of barely 51 can't run roughshod over a minority of 49 senators. Another argument is that it bolsters public confidence in the government, in that more matters will be passed, more legislation and decisions will be made by the Senate in a deliberate matter that involves bipartisan compromise. And yet another is that it reinforces that the Senate is different from the House. And the Senate, it's like a club. It has its own set of institutional norms. And one of them is that, yes, we work together more, or at least it had been at one point in the past, and that we are the more deliberative, mature body. That's the way we were supposed to be under the Constitution, despite the elitist and other really, really big problems with the original structure of the Senate, as opposed to the House, where you simply need a majority. So it distinguishes the Senate from the House. And then the final argument that you even have heard in the past from some Democrats is that this can cut both ways. Today, it may be climate change that's being blocked by the filibuster, by the 60-vote rule. Tomorrow, it could be, major tax cuts for corporations or individuals who can afford to pay much no, that's not a good argument, because that can be a budget matter. But it could be matters such as abortion, which is already being undercut, admittedly, or it could be other matters that Democrats or progressives might object to. And if there is a filibuster rule, they could block it from going through. I'll get to one example in a minute. In fact, I'll even present it now. In 2003, there was a bill being considered under the George W. Bush administration, an environmental, an energy bill that would have let oil companies off the hook for certain environmental damages for being the subject of litigation and liability. The Democrats then filibustered that bill, prevented it from going through. And as a result, the resulting cases against these petroleum companies, against these energy companies, yielded hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages for the public, for people who were affected by some of their products. So that's the final argument for it. It can go both ways. Some arguments against it, though, and a big one is that if there was ever an era where the Senate was deliberative, where it compromised, where it was reasonable, where people reached across party lines, that era is long gone. It's not the case anymore. So much is partisan now, so much is hostile now, that the notion of a compromising deliberative institution encouraged by a filibuster is ancient history. The other related one is that, no, this isn't a deliberative process now. It's simply, we have 60 votes, or we have 41 votes to block legislation from going ahead. Our party just doesn't want to see this go through at all. We're not deliberating anything. We're just blocking it. Another thing pertains to the filibuster's racist past, that even in its glory days or better days, it was used in the mid-20th century to block a lot of integrationist and equal rights legislation. So it's not as though it was ever a great institution or great practice to begin with. Another fundamental one is that it's not in the Constitution, as you folks all knew in response to my so-called trick question, which you responded to so well. Congratulations again. It's not in the Constitution. What is in the Constitution is for certain matters, a certain limited number of matters, such as treaties, 2/3 of senators are necessary to pass a treaty. The constitutional drafters had some specific things in mind that they wanted more than a majority for. Simply passing legislation was not one of them. They wanted 51 votes, or not 51, they wanted a simple majority of the Senate to be able to pass legislation, not some supermajority, which is de facto what we have with the filibuster and the cloture rules. So, and finally, it's really, I talked about one argument, well, we can't have majority rule running roughshod over people. What we really have now is minority rule running roughshod over people, in that not only in that 41 senators can block a popular piece of legislation from going through, but given that they often come from smaller states, as opposed to, the difference between California and Wyoming is, I don't know, we have like 70 times the number of people as Wyoming, something like that. 41 senators can theoretically come from can only represent 11% of the population. 11% of the population then can indirectly block legislation from going through. And that's minority rule run roughshod. Alternatives to this ridiculous practice. Maybe I shouldn't pass judgment, but I am. It's a ridiculous practice. In any event, alternatives to this, a number of them. One is just return to the real filibuster, as flawed as it was, so that senators will have to stand up. They may get good publicity or bad for trying to slow down a piece of legislation. Sometimes maybe that could work out well, but they can only delay it, and it's much less likely that they'd be able to absolutely block it. So they can get more attention for it, they can get greater deliberation on it by standing up. But by standing up and talking and trying to slow it down, but they can't absolutely block it. Another simple solution or simple alternative would be to reduce the number needed for cloture from 60 right now to 55. Whether that would be a great improvement is another matter, but it would be an improvement. And the final one, which is more likely, although whether it's very likely in the short term is another matter, is to increase the number of carve-outs. Or increase the kind of carve-outs. As I said, there are carve-outs or exceptions to the rule with respect to presidential appointees and with respect to the budget, or the budget reconciliation process, as it's technically called. Maybe carve-outs for democracy-oriented legislation, or maybe conceivably for climate change. That would still require changing the Senate rules, but it's conceivable that with senators such as Manchin from Virginia and Sinema from Arizona still objecting to changes in the filibuster, to reforming it, maybe President Biden can convince them and their colleagues can convince them to allow for some carve-outs going forward. We can hope. How likely it is your conjecture is as good as mine. So what does this mean for climate change and environmental legislation? Well, as I pointed out, it's not always bad. It depends who's running the show. When, as in the early 2000s, you had Republicans dominating the government, the Democrats prevented some anti-environmental legislation from going through with the filibuster. But more often, it's worked to the detriment of pro-climate change and other pro-environmental legislation. Under the Obama administration, the American Clean Energy and Security Act was proposed. It included stronger emission standards and a cap and trade provision. It didn't even get to a vote because Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, knew that the Republicans could simply filibuster it and block it from going through because he didn't have 60 votes to get it through. So even without the filibuster being actively employed, it really was a block. It really did block some promising environmental legislation. As for the two major bills being considered right now, the bipartisan bill that was passed by the Senate that includes it includes some environmental provisions. You people may know it better than I do, but for example, I believe $7.5 billion for electric vehicle recharging stations, just a fraction of what was needed and what Biden originally proposed, but that's a step in the right direction. That has actually had enough votes to pass cloture. It got well over 60 votes. So the filibuster won't block that. And one reason, there are two reasons probably why Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, let that go through. One is that he may have some relatively moderate colleagues in relatively moderate states who needed to be able to say they voted for this popular bill. But the other is that this way he can say, oh, we don't always use the filibuster. And this could be an example, even though he's used it with respect to most other pieces of Democratic legislation under Obama and now under Biden. The second big bill is, as you know, the reconciliation bill, which could be up to $3.5 trillion. That actually would require just a majority, or again, in our special circumstances, 50 votes plus Vice President Harris to break the tie. And that won't be subject to a filibuster because it is a budget reconciliation vote. But there are many other pieces of potential legislation down the line that, as you know, can benefit the environment, but that would be blocked by a filibuster. And you can't simply call them budget matters every time. A Senate parliamentarian has ruled that only maybe a couple of times a year can you label something a budget reconciliation bill, or otherwise use the budget process to just reduce the number of votes needed to a majority. Now, I'm almost finished here, but one thing I have to say is that actually the two bills that may be blocked by the filibuster are really not purely or specifically climate change bills. They're actually the two big democracy bills that are being considered by the Senate to cure many of the ills in the way our voting systems work, including ills that are being introduced in a number of state legislatures as we speak. Democracy suppressing bills to suppress votes, to change the rules of who will decide if there are election disputes, to really suppress democracy in various ways. And I would consider these bills pro-climate change and the necessity of overcoming the filibuster really important, because who's going to vote for climate change going forward for climate change bills, for action to restrict climate change going forward? The kinds of people that these anti-democratic state bills that are being passed right and left, such as in Texas, such as in Georgia, et cetera, those kinds of bills will restrict younger people from voting, making it tough for them to vote, making it tougher for minorities and who may be extraordinarily affected by climate change from voting, other people in the pro-climate change coalition from voting. So these pro-democracy bills, if they're stymied by the filibuster, that whole process could stymie action on climate change going forward in the future as well. Finally, the chances of eliminating or reforming the filibuster. You know, in some ways, your guess is as good as mine. A lot will hinge right now on whether Senators Manchin and Sinema can be persuaded to at least vote for carve-outs or otherwise adjust their positions. Whether they'll do so, I don't know. Senator Manchin comes from a coal-producing state. You would not only not call him very progressive, you might not even, in some respects, call him very moderate, but perhaps their colleagues and President Biden, given his background in the Senate, can either twist their arms or persuade them and maybe one or two other senators to come around such that the Democrats can change the filibuster rule. And again, to change the rule only requires a majority. It doesn't require 60 votes. I should mention that. That's a very important part of all this. But this could really be, I don't want to say the biggest challenge of Joe Biden's presidency, but really given that there's COVID, given the economy, but really in terms of the long-term future of democracy and in terms of the long-term future of taking strong action on climate change, these really could be, these two bills and action on climate change and action against the filibuster could be the real test of his presidency. So thanks very much. I welcome your questions and comments and everything else. Thanks again for getting my trick question on the Constitution so right. And again, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful overview, and you've covered a lot of the questions that I had coming into this. I'm going to go back and ask a couple more in detail, but I'd like a little more detail about the process for elimination and the nuclear option. Is that one of the things that it comes into the filibuster conversation when someone wants to override a filibuster?
Well, I'll start with the nuclear option. That was a term that was used, I believe, first in 2013, when, and that was when, remember, the president was Obama over those days, and the Democrats controlled the Senate at that point. Whatever year it was, the Democrats controlled the Senate, and Harry Reid, or someone who was the Democratic majority leader of the Senate, or someone else used the term, said, we may need to go to the nuclear option, which means which simply meant eliminating the filibuster rule, or eliminating the 60-vote cloture rule, which I'm using interchangeably with the filibuster rule, really, to such that we only need a majority to get Senate appointees through, to get presidential appointees through the Senate, as opposed to the 60-vote rule for bringing a matter to a vote. And then the term was used again in 2017, I believe, when there was the possibility of the Republican majority Senate being stymied by the Democratic minority with respect to Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch being nominated. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate majority leader then, also resorted to what was called the nuclear option, that is eliminating the 60-vote cloture rule for Supreme Court justices who hadn't been included in the 2013 change.
And so that's what you're referring to as a carve out. That's basically creating a carve out on the fly for a specific issue or for a specific motion.
That's almost it, except these are a whole, it's not a specific motion, it's a whole class of issues that would be considered. As I said, budget reconciliation being one, and presidential appointees being another. They don't have to do it every time. Now that they've established this is the rule, going forward every time since 2013, for all other appointees, and since 2017 for Supreme Court appointees, all you need is a majority.
So the process for eliminating the filibuster at all would be a motion that would have to be supported by a simple majority?
Yes, a change in the Senate rules. Right. So, and in this case, again, it could be, it would be the bare majority of 50 senators and Vice President Harris breaking the tie. But that's all that's needed to change this. Great.
You mentioned the minority structure of the Senate. The Senate is specifically structured to give a disproportionate voice to the minority party. Currently, the 50 Republican senators represent 43.5% of the population. Isn't the filibuster just compounding that disproportion? And how is that defensible? How is it defended? It seems like the body itself gives them a disproportionate voice, and then the filibuster on top of that is giving them an extra bonus disproportion.
Well, some of the arguments, I think I disagree with these arguments, but some of these arguments are that, well, we need this for compromise because, to be acted in a bipartisan way. Of course, the counter argument is that, bipartisanship has kind of gone out the door for most things, and it's only through just a particular set of circumstances, including Mitch McConnell trying to say, oh, look, we don't always use the filibuster, that the big infrastructure bill got through the Senate. There also are arguments that, I didn't mention this, but I've heard this also, that, the United States was never meant to be a pure democracy. It's a republic. It's really each state agreed to join together. And therefore, if some have a disproportionate role, or if they set rules that aren't purely democratic. That's the way our republic operates. Again, I don't buy into it, but that's another one. One thing I'd add that I really should have mentioned in the talk itself is that as someone who's looked at comparative democracy and justice systems across the globe, we do seem kind of unique in that we have this filibuster rule on top of more checks and balances than almost any other country on earth. We've got the president can veto legislation passed by Congress. We have two houses of Congress as opposed to one parliamentary, as opposed to a single body parliamentary system in many countries. We've got an incredibly powerful judiciary, more than almost any other country, that can act as a de facto super legislature in the Supreme Court and even the lower federal courts and state courts. We've got a federalist system where so much is decided on a state and sometimes even local level. The fact that we have this filibuster rule on top of all of that is really, it's really almost a parody of how a complicated, bureaucratic, obstructionist system could work that's meant to slow down change and reforms or to frustrate democracy. That's the way it is, unfortunately, but it's particularly ironic that we have this on top, compounding the other features of our system, which have so many checks and balances, so many more than most other democracies across the globe.
I'm going to hand it over to Maricel right now, who's been monitoring our chat, and see what questions are coming from over there. You're muted, Maricel.
Okay. I have this question. What happens if the climate justice succeed to amend the filibuster and the Senate turns majority anti-climate justice? We've had this before in the Senate. Isn't this just asking for trouble later?
To make a long story short, yeah, that's a good question. And that's the big argument that even some Senate moderates in the past had used in favor of the filibuster, including Joe Biden, that if the shoe's on the other foot, if the Republicans control the presidency and both houses of Congress, then it will be much harder to pass what we might consider regressive legislation, or however you want to style their legislation. The two counter arguments to that are that historically, it does seem as though, number one, historically, you could argue that many more pieces of progressive legislation have been blocked by the filibuster than what we might call regressive, or let's say Republican or conservative legislation, to use a non-pejorative term, a less pejorative term. That's partly because perhaps the Democrats haven't resorted to it as much. And also there's the political reality. The Democratic Party is more fractured than the Republican Party. It's easier for Republicans to peel off people to vote with them on certain issues, as they've done in the past, than for the Democrats to peel off Republicans these days. So even though nominally or not just theoretically, the actual structure means that it can cut both ways, it has cut more in favor of conservative rather than progressive issues, or blocking more progressive legislation than conservative legislation. And the second argument in terms of the political realities is that you could argue that the two biggest things that Senate Minority Leader McConnell and his colleagues care about are appointees, special judicial appointees, and budget matters, including taxes. So they've already got exceptions for the issues they care about most themselves. Democracy, climate change, women's rights, civil rights, social justice issues. They're perfectly happy requiring 60 votes for those to be able to come to a vote. They already have carve-outs for what they most want. So that's another reason why this may cut unequally or unfairly more in favor of conservative bills and causes rather than progressive bills and causes, even though it's nominally a neutral process that can cut both ways.
I have another question. So can the filibuster be used to block just every kind of bill. So, for example, did the Democrats filibuster the Trump tax bill?
As best I recall, no, because it was a spending bill. It was a budget bill that went through, that could go through with a majority. I'm almost sure that's the case. I haven't reviewed that specifically, but I'm almost sure that was the case. So they couldn't, again, it's a budget / tax bill. So it's part of the carve-out, part of the exception to the rule.
Nice. Okay, Audrey?
Yeah, I'm interested in the argument that the filibuster is in place to promote. The filibuster has been defended as forcing compromise and debate. Mm-hmm. Senator Sinema believes, states that the elimination of the filibuster will weaken democracy's guardrails. But the inertia caused by that it causes in the Senate means that there's been a move away from typical legislation and towards executive orders and budget resolutions, which are much less democratic than legislation. Can you explain, without any need to defend, this sort of democracy argument for the filibuster?
Well, I mean, I'll start in a slightly different place, in that President Obama, frustrated by the filibuster, resorted to a lot more executive actions, arguably, than his predecessors. Bush may have also, but excuse me, Obama certainly did. And, there are arguments that I may cut across the spectrum of constitutional jurisprudence to say that he went too far. And then Trump after him went too far. And Biden may be even going too far now. And a lot of that is litigated in the courts. Some of these presidents' executive actions have been held up. Some of them have been overruled. So there's an argument, but I think presidential overreach in what could be an undemocratic way, along the lines of what arguably Obama, Trump, and Biden have done, is in response to an undemocratic rule of the Senate. Again, never anticipated by the framers of the Constitution, but an undemocratic rule that says you don't need 51 votes to pass, to in effect allow a bill to be voted on and then passed. You need 60 votes. And as we discussed, that's in and of itself is undemocratic, but considering how small a part of the population that may represent, those 41 senators who block legislation, it becomes all the more egregiously undemocratic.
Maricel, do you have something?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you speculate why the Dems haven't been talking about a carve-out for climate environmental issues? And I'd like to add civil rights also.
It's only speculation, but my speculation is that well, my speculation is, I've got two speculations. One is that the Democrats have tried to prioritize a few really big bills. The first one that went through, I forget what's called the COVID Relief Act, but the massive $1.9 trillion bill that went through earlier. And now these two huge infrastructure bills. I'm calling them infrastructure bills, but they're obvious, but especially the bigger one, the proposed 3.5 trillion one, is more than what has conventionally been considered infrastructure. They're focusing on that. And so and then after that, they're going to try to focus on these two big pro-democracy bills. So there's only so much they could try to push through at a given time. But having said that, in effect, they are trying to push through climate change bills to some extent through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but to a much greater extent through the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill. That includes some incredibly important and potential provisions to benefit climate change, to act against climate change, to protect the environment. So a lot of it is in there. And I think part of, and some of what Biden has done as well through, and to get to the civil rights question, at least to some extent, a lot of what Biden did through, or his administration did through the initial $1 trillion bill, and I believe this will be included in the infrastructure bill, are provisions that may not have been framed in terms of civil rights, but disproportionately benefit minority populations affected by poverty and other forms of social injustice. That's not an exact answer there to your question, Maricel, but I think he's framing a lot of this, a lot of what he's doing in terms of more politically neutral terms to try to dampen opposition to them, even while a lot of good stuff regarding the environment, regarding minority benefits and rights, are regarding cutting in half childhood poverty, for example, which is good for the entire population, but disproportionately affects minorities. He's pushing them through under the rubric of infrastructure and COVID relief and economic relief, which are more neutral terms to use. And it may be politically wise that he's doing it. Again, that's just my speculation, but I think that's part of what's going on here throughout his whole legislative agenda.
Okay. So I have another question. So do you think that if we simply got rid of the silent filibuster, that angst over its existence, as well as the current version's negative impacts, would simply fade away?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question if we reverted to the original filibuster with people simply talking to try to delay legislation?
I had a related question that I think might clarify that about the silent filibuster came in at the same time as dual tracking. Is that correct? So that the filibuster didn't have to stop the entire workings. So if we reverted, we were looking at, there are various suggestions to reform the filibuster, and I think the question relates to are any of them would any of them be effective in rebalancing the current filibuster? Since the current version makes it sort of less visible to the public, both that it's silent and that it can happen in the background, it avoids the sort of public relations disincentive to be the person standing in the middle, to be standing in the way of things moving forward. And it reduces the pressure to actually use that time to discuss or to debate. Do you think that changing that either by reintroducing the speaking filibuster or by single tracking would make a difference in how it's used?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I didn't get into dual tracking because I thought I was throwing in enough or too much into my original talk anyway, but I'm glad you raised it because it's an important matter. For those who aren't familiar, it used to be that a filibuster, people just talking and talking and talking, brought the Senate business to a halt. So it could get them bad publicity if they were doing that. It could get their fellow senators just annoyed at them or infuriated with them because those senators wanted to get back home or because they wanted to move on to other business, or for whatever reasons. But what was introduced, I believe in the 70s, but I'm not positive, by Senator Robert Byrd, I think this is sometimes called the Byrd rule, but regardless, if I'm not getting my rules mixed up, was this dual track process. And what that means is that on the one hand, the Senate can walk and chew gum at the same time. Previously, it couldn't. It could consider a piece of legislation and senators could filibuster it. At the same time, later that same day, they could go on to another issue which wasn't as controversial, which senators weren't filibustering, and could get on with business that way. And in some respects, again, this is a way in which a seemingly neutral rule or reform can actually be counterproductive. On the one hand, you'd think, okay, well, if one thing is blocked, then they could go on and do another thing. That's good. The whole Senate isn't ground to a halt. But what it really means is that, as you said, Audrey, that therefore the Senate can still get on with some business, and it won't attract nearly, and except for certain circumstances, it won't attract nearly the same attention that a major piece of legislation is being filibustered or blocked, because it still seems like the Senate is doing something. If we got rid of both of those rules, that is the dual track, so that it's just one single matter could be considered at a time, and we reverted to the old-fashioned filibuster, by which a senator could simply, instead of silently objecting to a bill, the senator has to go up and speak and speak and speak and occupy the public's attention and take up his or her their fellow senators' time. Maybe that could be a reform. You still might need, if there's still the 60-vote cloture rule, then that might not be totally productive, but it could be steps in the right direction by creating more public pressure to move on with things rather than gumming up the entire works and blocking any piece of controversial legislation that came along.
Are there any disadvantages to the dual tracking?
Well, in the formal sense, no, but it makes it easier. In the formal sense, it allows the Senate to do a couple of make different things at the same time, but or the Senate as a whole to do it. Obviously, committee work continues to go on, but the big disadvantage is what I sketched regarding it makes it easier to get away with filibusters without getting as much attention from the public or opposition from your fellow senators who may have other priorities they want to pursue. If you had a single track, their priorities would be blocked, and it could create incentives for them to move on and to overcome the filibuster.
I see. Okay. And I have another question. What about only allowing filibusters by senators who represent a majority of the population? Is that possible?
Sounds good well, I almost said sounds good to me, but that's a very biased answer. And I think even, look, the big picture is, I think filibusters are undemocratic, counterproductive, particularly in our current political environment. They just block more potentially good, including anti-climate change legislation from going through than they yield better pieces of legislation. But if you're going to have a filibuster, then at all, then I don't know. I guess you'd want to have, you wouldn't want to draw a line between someone from a big state or a small state, or from who represents a majority of the population as opposed to a minority. To the extent that the filibuster has any validity, it could feed into greater deliberation on certain issues. That's not the reality now, but I personally don't think that drawing that line would be productive if we still had a filibuster.
Okay.
Although give me 5 minutes to think about it, I might change my mind, but that's my instant reaction.
So can there be a relay filibusters? One starts and passes it on to the next senator?
Yeah. And that was the case I think I mentioned the case back in 1946 of a bunch of senators filibustering a bill, one of the first anti-discrimination bills, actually, and preventing it from going forward. So, it's a good question. I'm almost sure, yes, that's the case. You can have one senator filibustering, then another. Of course, they may all get negative publicity or pushback from their fellow senators out of it, but I don't think there's anything that restricts it to just one senator.
Right. Okay. Do we have time for other questions? Oh.
Well, I was just going to ask one more, if you could, if it's not, perhaps not a brief answer, but one of the big arguments for the filibuster is to avoid the tyranny of the majority and to make sure and to ensure that minority opinions have a voice. Is there any model that you've seen in your, you referred early on to different models that you've seen around the world in your studies. Is there another model that you feel ensures that voice without being as obstructive as the filibuster?
There's no one country that comes to mind, but if you do have, but there are debates that occur both just within our own country. I'm going to circle back just to the U.S. You know, these issues get aired in so many forms. If it's a major piece of legislation, the president making an announcement about or their administration promoting it, and then pushback from the opposition party or even people within their own party, even outside of Congress. Then within Congress, there's time that's set aside for debate on certain matters. Maybe as a compromise, although I don't think this would satisfy the pro-filibuster forces, more time could be set aside for certain pieces to debate certain pieces of major legislation. They're also considered in committee, and sometimes if these are major pieces of legislation, they're debated within the committee and journalists and social media cover these debates. So yeah, I think some things at the margin could be done to promote greater debate, greater awareness of issues, but I don't think they're really essential well, I'll leave it at that. I think some things at the margin could be done to promote greater debate and without going to the extreme of what we now have of the filibuster and the tyranny of the minority.
I'll turn it over to Maricel. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, for a very illuminating talk session about the filibuster. And so I'd like to continue to say that whether or not the filibuster is eliminated, we should continue to push for passage of the numerous climate bills that are in the pipeline and also for the People's Act. Coming together, our voices can get louder. So in the next few weeks, Congress will vote on the infrastructure and the reconciliation bills. We, at our climate moment, have been aggressively pursuing personal meetings with members of Congress. We are targeting key committee members who are writing details of these bills. We're asking you to join us in these meetings. You can email Karen at karenjoharrington@gmail.com so you can join us. We invite you to join us in our Climate Reality Bay Area meetings also to strategize swift passage of climate change bills and climate justice bills. You can also call and write to your members of Congress and also spread the word to everybody you know to get on the bandwagon. If we come together, our voices are louder than individual. So that's what we're trying to do. Get our voices be heard as loud as possible so members of Congress can hear us. And we want to demand that Congress act on climate bills by passing the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill. And again, I said my emphasis is when we get together, we speak more louder. So thank you again, Steve, for the illuminating talk on filibuster. Remember Steve's blog, A Promised Land, America as a Developing Country. Thanks everybody for attending this forum.
Thank you.